Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Thank you all for your ongoing support. We couldn't be doing this without you. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica will manage them as always in about 30 or 35 minutes. Dan, it's time for me to bring you on. You've got 3 terrific questions for the topics today. How are you?
I'm really good, Kim. How about yourself?
It's busy, but that's great, right?
Exactly.
So here, let me get to your key questions and turn it over to you. Question number 1, Biden's gamble. Do Americans want a bigger government? Number 2, why American isolationism is here to stay. And third, voter suppression and ballot security. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks as always to all of you for being with us today for another installment in our ongoing series. As Kim mentioned, of course, as usual, we have 3 topics that we're going to discuss over the first half of the program. And then at the bottom of the hour at 11:30 Pacific time, I'll be joined by Jessica, and I'll do my best to answer as many of your questions as possible. But let's go ahead and dig right in. So topic number 1, do Americans want a bigger government? One of the biggest questions in American politics right now is how much room Democrats have to go big on spending and on taxes. And the question is, if a year of COVID stimulus checks and government intervention has fundamentally altered how Americans view the role of government. Or on the other hand, will things snap back to a pre-COVID era where voters tend to be a little bit more suspicious of government involvement? Obviously, this is a question that Biden and his advisors think about every single day, because while they certainly see an opportunity here for a more aggressive and more expansionist form of U.S. government interaction in the country, they're also very wary that if they push too far, it could cause a snapback and redound against them, not only in their efforts to pass the infrastructure legislation that the president is currently championing, but also potentially cost them in next year's midterm elections. So before we go any further, right away, let's start with our first question to frame this discussion. I'll be eager to hear your thoughts. Do you think, all of you, that the pandemic has made voters more receptive to a larger role for government in our lives? Option 1 is yes, it has. And Biden could pass a New Deal or Great Society legislative package, such as the appetite for additional government involvement. Alternatively, yes, voters are interested in a more activist government, but they're not quite ready to give Biden a blank check. Or third, no, once COVID ends, voters will be very wary of large government funding. So, Jessica, let's see how our group did on this first question of the day. Very, very interesting. You guys seem to have carved a middle path here. 64% say that there is a greater appetite for government involvement, but it's not unlimited. And so Biden does have to be careful. 24%, almost a quarter of you, believe that there is a New Deal, Great Society type of opportunity available here for Biden. And a smaller percentage, 12%, believe that this shift in voter attitude is temporary. And when society opens back up again, that the attitudes will return. So let's take those numbers and let's move the conversation forward. It's worth noting, and I mentioned the Great Society and the New Deal, history moves in cycles. And just as an era of very expansive government that began with Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s, ultimately concluded with Ronald Reagan's election just 40 plus years later. And at some point, Reagan's vision of smaller government will conclude as well. And at least right now, the size and scope of Biden's infrastructure proposal suggests that Biden is betting that his presidency, that time has now arrived. And so that this really is a major historical shift, as roughly a quarter of you suggested. Now, this is really a remarkable transformation for Joe Biden. You think about it, when he ran for president last year, there were times when he sounded like he was running for Barack Obama's third term in office. But at this stage of his own presidency, just a few months in, Biden seems to have decided that instead of Barack Obama's third term, maybe he'd like Franklin Roosevelt's fifth term. Now, there's nothing in Biden's past, recent past or distant past, that would have predicted this move to such an aggressive agenda. Think back to the primaries last year, when he ran as a more careful, cautious centrist against the more aggressive left-leaning candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. He stayed away from the Green New Deal, from single-payer healthcare, from free college tuition, in order to hew a more traditional centrist path. And Biden got those progressives to turn out for him in November, not because he was advocating for a very aggressive role for government, but because he wasn't Donald Trump. And then through the whole post-election period, when Trump was going on about how the election had been stolen from him, Biden kept a very low profile. So by Inauguration Day, I think most people assumed that this would be, in Biden's own words, a transitional presidency, something not very daring and something more, as I said, something more careful and cautious. But at some point over that time period, Biden discovered a previously undetected radical progressive lurking within him. And more accurately, what happened is I think he understood that the American people, as they tend to do, as we tend to do during times of real controversy and strife, we tend to turn toward government when we need them. The Great Depression, World War II, the unrest of the 1960s. And Biden and his time see this as a very similar moment, which will lead to not just a temporary, but an ongoing comfort level among the American people with a larger and more ambitious role for government in their lives. Now, like I said, this current era of smaller government, this has been going on for a while, really since Reagan's election just over 40 years ago. Reagan declared at that time, as some of you may remember, that government was more of an obstacle than a solution. And since then, not just under Republican presidents, but under Democratic presidents, that center-right orthodoxy, that the federal government should be more efficient and less obtrusive and more deferential to the private sector and community interests, that's prevailed under both Republican and Democratic presidents. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama largely accepted that thesis, even while pushing for some expanded role for government in certain areas. And Biden looked like he was going to be more of an ideological heir to those two men. But this moment seems to have gotten him to think much, much more ambitiously. Now, Biden could end up overreaching. And I think it's notable that almost 2/3 of you said that while the American people were open to a greater role for government in their lives, that it was not a blank check. Though the possibilities for overreaching are significant. Biden could also be derailed by issues like immigration, the same way LBJ's legacy was largely, domestic legacy was largely obscured by Vietnam. But this is a very unique moment in history, not just because of what the virus has done to our country and our world, but how it's affecting our politics. And Biden, at least, has begun to think of himself as an ideological heir, not to Clinton and Obama, but more to Roosevelt and to Johnson. And obviously, we'll talk much more about this in the weeks ahead as the infrastructure proposal that Biden has developed moves forward. But no question, this Joe Biden is a much different one than we saw on the campaign trail last year, or that we've seen through his previous several decades of public service. Okay, let's move on. Topic number 2, why American isolationism is here to stay. Now, the first thing I should do is admit that the word isolationism is probably not the question we need to be asking. So maybe the thing to do for this topic is to recast the question as to whether American protectionism is here to stay. Now, the sentiment among the American people right now supports both of those concepts, both isolationism and protectionism. But Biden is working very hard for all sorts of reasons to reestablish the United States diplomatic relationships around the world. So let's think about protectionism when it comes to trade and economic engagement as a more narrow and a more specific form of economic isolationism taking root. So now we've talked before about how Biden has always been more cautious when it comes to international trade than either Obama or Clinton were during their presidencies. And during the campaign last year, Biden backed away, if you remember, Biden backed away from his support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the 14-country trade deal with Asian and Latin American countries that was designed to form an economic bulwark against China that he, Biden, had advocated for very strongly when he was Obama's vice president. And during the transition, Biden let it be known he wasn't really in much of a hurry to take away the tariffs on China that the Trump administration had imposed during Trump's presidency. So we're seeing the clues. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, tariffs on China. Maybe this Democrat, Joe Biden, isn't the same type of free trader that Clinton and Obama were. And now that he's taken office, we're hearing even stronger language from his appointees and his allies. Catherine Tai, who Biden selected to serve as his U.S. trade representative, was testifying before Congress recently. And she was asked whether the goal of a trade agreement between two countries should be the elimination of tariffs and trade barriers. I'm going to read you her answer, so listen to this. Keep in mind this is from the U.S. trade representative that Biden has appointed. Quote, maybe if you'd asked me this question 5 or 10 years ago, I would have been inclined to say yes, unquote. But Tsai went on. She said the experience of the last few years, including the emergency of the pandemic and the impact of the Trump administration's trade wars, led her to believe that, quote again, that our trade policies need to be nuanced and need to take into account all the lessons that we've learned, many of them very painful, from our most recent history, end quote. Now that's the United States trade representative talking about, quote, the painful lessons of trade. Definitely not the language we're used to hearing from either Democratic or Republican administrations for many decades heading back into the past. I'll give you another example. Some of you may know that U.S. Senator Chris Coons from Delaware is Biden's closest ally and closest friend in the Senate. And Coons has been referred to as Biden's shadow secretary of state. Here's what Biden said not too long ago. Excuse me, here's what Coons said not too long ago. Sorry about that. Coons said, quote, everyone who was involved in business or government in the 80s or 90s has seen some of the promise of globalization come through, but a lot of the harm has been unexpected, broader, sharper, deeper. I'm going to repeat that. A lot of the harm has been unexpectedly broader, sharper, deeper. Biden believes we need to change direction on trade, unquote. Biden needs to change direction. Biden believes we need to change direction on trade, a direct quote from one of the president's closest allies. So there you go. This is a new era for international engagement and economic protectionism under a Biden administration. Now, part of Biden's shift is the result of the dependence on foreign manufacturing this country has maintained that we got to see in very stark terms during the pandemic over the last year. But a lot of this shift also comes from populist political pressure that's been building for many years. One of Trump's great advantages over Hillary Clinton in 2016, if you remember, was her record on trade policy and how much that hurt her in the upper Midwest and the industrial heartland, especially among the white working class voters who Trump took away from the Democratic Party in 2016. But last year, Biden moved away from Clinton-Obama trade orthodoxy, and he largely neutralized the issue, and obviously did much better among those voters and in those key states. So, question for you on this topic of free trade: what do you think? You obviously know what I think now, but we'd be interested in your opinion. Is America less interested in free trade than we used to be? And our options, as you can see, are yes, our country is turning inward from the rest of the world. Second, sort of once again, more of a middle ground. The US will seek out trade deals, but much less aggressively. Or third, no, we're not less interested in free trade, and that voters see the need for US global economic leadership. Like I said, I've already told you what I think on this, but let's see what you think. Jessica, what have we got? Oh, once again, a very middle ground approach among our group. 2/3, 67%, say that the US will still seek out trade deals, but less aggressively. 12% agree that this isolationism, or at least this protectionism, is much more stark. And 21% say that no, voters are not rejecting free trade and economic engagement on the global scale. But once again, very much of a middle ground for our group here today. So we talked last, I want to give you another example of Biden's approach on trade issues, particularly as it relates to his efforts to rebuild the American economy. We talked last week about his infrastructure and jobs package. But one of the most difficult aspects of this proposal is Biden's plan for alternative energy and green technology. And he's already indicated an interest in investing immense sums of money into transforming our economy for many reasons, but foremost among them, to protect us against the threat of climate change. Now, one of the president's major talking points has been to rebuild Americans' manufacturing capacity, again, for all sorts of reasons. But here's the catch. Most of the technology that we need for solar power, for wind energy, and for biofuels is produced overseas. So if Biden's top priority is climate change, it would be a lot faster to rely on foreign producers to provide us with these technologies. Ramping up American manufacturing would create more jobs in this country, but it would take a lot longer. So let's watch Biden through the spring and summer and see which of these two priorities comes first for him. But even before we see how Biden goes on this, I think we'd be interested in hearing what you think should be a higher priority. So question number 3, which will be, it's a typo on my part, not on Jessica's, which will be more important to Biden? Climate change on one hand, or manufacturing and job growth on the other? Which will be more important to Biden? One, he'll prioritize green tech even if the jobs are sent abroad, because climate change is that important and that urgent. Second, he'll prioritize US job creation, even if it slows our move toward green technology and alternative energies. Or third, both. Biden will find a way to balance between the two evenly. And once again, let's see what our group thinks. 60%, you guys are in a very middle of the road type of mood today. 60% think that Biden will balance the two evenly, but very instructive in looking at our group. By a 4-to-1 margin, 32% to 8%. By a 4-to-1 margin, our group believes that Biden will prioritize US job creation in increasing manufacturing capacity here, even if it slows the move toward green technology. So the middle ground answers are interesting, but I think much more much more impactful, is that very large 4-to-1 margin of those of you who do believe that investing in a domestic industrial policy, and of course the protectionism that comes with it, will be more of a priority for this administration. Now, Biden can't afford full-on protectionism. As I mentioned earlier, he's been working furiously since taking office to rebuild our diplomatic relationships around the world, primarily as a bulwark as he prepares to confront China more forcefully. It's also beginning to look like Russia might be becoming more aggressive in Ukraine, and that's something we'll need to talk about in the weeks ahead. And what that means, of course, is that US relationships in Europe are becoming even more important. But here's the catch, here's the challenge for Biden on this front. In the 21st century, successful diplomacy requires economic engagement too. And especially given how aggressive China has been in terms of its own international investment in economic outreach, Biden's going to be under immense amounts of pressure as he works to rebuild our diplomatic relationships. He'll be under huge pressure from our allies to increase back to ramp back up trade relationships in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, if only for geopolitical and international reasons. So Biden isn't pulling up the bridges just yet. But political sentiment in this country is definitely not in favor of more international trade. And that's going to create challenges going forward for Biden and for the US and global economy as he tries to balance between the need to rebuild this nation's economy and to engage more forcefully with the rest of the world. All right, let's move on to our third and our final topic, voting rights and boycotts. So last week, Major League Baseball announced that they were moving their annual All-Star game out of Atlanta to protest the state of Georgia's new voting law. And that was the most visible action taken by dozens of American companies to protest this law and similar pieces of legislation around the country. There have been bills proposed in 47 of the 50 states to change voting procedures, to put additional challenges or obstacles in the path to voting. And this fight has gotten very partisan and very ugly very quickly. So right away, before we get into this topic in more depth, last week I asked you about the US, whether the US should boycott the Beijing Olympics next year. So let me ask the question more broadly this time, now that Major League Baseball has pulled its All-Star game out of Georgia and moved it to Colorado. Broader question, are boycotts an effective way of affecting state policy? Yes, they pressure decision makers to reconsider bad policy. No, they end up harming innocent workers. And a pretty good sized number of you did not think that the US should boycott the Olympics in Beijing next year. So now with a broader question, Jessica, let's see what our group thinks, moving it out of that one instance. Look at that. 3/4 of you think that boycotts pressure decision makers to reconsider bad policy. Only 1/4 tend to oppose them. And so one thing we'll explore going forward in a future program perhaps is where you would draw that line, because it is worth noting that that 75% of you who thought that boycotts work, a lot of that 3/4 of our group that support boycotts didn't support one of the Olympics next year. And it'll be interesting as we move forward to find out how those distinctions kick in. But let's take a few minutes before we go to your questions. Let's take a few minutes to talk about what the Georgia law does. Now, the law passed by the Georgia legislature does contain significant new restrictions on voting, and some are likely to make it disproportionately more difficult for poor voters and voters from minority communities to cast their ballots. But there are also ways in which the law expands voter access. And I'm going to run through a few of these provisions just so we're all starting from the same point. So the Georgia law shrinks the window for voters to request mail ballots. It used to be that a Georgia voter could ask for an absentee ballot or a mail ballot 6 months before the election day. And the new law says voters can start requesting ballots just 78 days out, about 2.5 months. And it says that counties can begin sending ballots to voters just 29 days before the election, a little bit less than a month, rather than the previous 49 days. It also sets an earlier cutoff for ballot application requests. Now, the law's critics say that any mail delays with these shorter periods could lead to voters not getting ballots in time or not being able to return them in time. But supporters of the law say voters simply don't need the 180 degrees they used to have to request ballots, and that moving up the cutoff date actually makes it less likely voters will receive ballots too late to get them back in time to be counted. The law also says that counties in the states can send mail ballot applications only to voters who request them, as opposed to simply sending every registered voter a ballot application like we do in California. It also imposes new voter ID requirements. Voters who cast mail ballots will have to provide one of several different forms of identification. And this provision replaces what they used to do in Georgia and do in many states, where they match signatures between the signature on the ballot and the signature on the voter registration. Now, this is one of the most controversial aspects of the law, because the critics say it's most likely to affect minority voters. The supporters counter by saying that actually asking for a certain type of ID, not a photo ID, but any one of a number of different types of ID, that the state of Georgia will now require to be provided free of charge to voters who are registering, that'll actually be a better requirement, because matching signatures is such an inexact science. One that's gotten a particular amount of attention is a ban on handing out food and water within 150 feet of a polling place. Now, Republicans say this is aimed at stopping outside groups from influencing voters. If someone shows up in a Biden cap or a Stacey Abrams t-shirt offering food and drink, that might influence their vote. Democrats say that it's actually very cruel, because it's not appropriate to make it harder to wait for people to wait in long lines to vote, particularly on very hot days or very cold days. Now, election officials, not advocates, are permitted to set up water stations, but they're not required to. So that one's gotten the most attention. And then of all of these, most of these I think have some type of reasonable middle ground between the two parties. But the one aspect here, if you'll permit me to take sides for a minute, the one provision of this bill that's the most problematic is one that will give state legislators much more power over county and local elections. The law states that the Georgia Assembly would select the chair of the state elections board instead of having the board chaired by the Secretary of State, which was the case, of course, in last year's election. It says that the state election board can investigate county election boards and has the power to suspend county election superintendents. And this one worries me because this does give one party in Georgia right now, the Republicans, but at other times, Democrats, to give one party overwhelming power over the administration of our elections. And like I said, these other provisions generally would have some type of middle ground available to them, which I believe could be acceptable to people in both parties. But the idea of putting the majority party, Republican or Democrat, completely unfettered in charge of voting is not a good thing. And that's one that I think does create real difficulties for the Georgia system going forward. Now, in just a minute, we're going to go to your questions, but I do want to point out that the Georgia law does expand voting access in a few ways too. It guarantees a minimum number of drop boxes in the state, which was not the case before. It now says that every county has to have a drop box, in rural counties in particular, did not previously. The Georgia law adds an additional day of early voting in most counties. It says that at least 2 Saturdays of early voting for each primary and general election. Previous Georgia law said just 1 Saturday. And it allows counties to choose when their early voting locations are open, as long as they're open for at least 8 hours a day, between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And of course, and then the last provision I want to mention is, this goes back to the discussion we were having a moment ago about the food and drink provision of the bill. It also adds more resources for precincts so that lines don't get too long, so that people don't have to wait to vote for extended periods of time. The law basically requires the state to monitor polling locations to see if any have lines longer than an hour. And in those cases, the state's required to either open new precinct locations right away or to add existing staffing resources to the existing locations. So either way, if the lines are too long, Georgia is now going to mandate to the counties that they have to do something about it. One last question for all of you, and then we'll get into our discussion. More broadly, not just in Georgia, but across the country, should Congress decide on voting access rules, or should the decisions be left to the states? Option 1, Congress should decide about voting rules, no matter which party's in the majority, Democrats now, but Republicans at some point in the future. Option 2, the states should decide for themselves. That's the way a federalist government is supposed to work. Or third, the Congress sets minimum standards for voting access and availability, but then the states decide on the specifics. So while this question is obviously taking place in the context of the Georgia law, it's a broader question. And so I'll be interested in seeing your responses. All right. Once again, a sensible middle ground answer. More than 2/3, 69% of you think that the Congress should set minimum standards, but every state ought to decide for themselves. And much smaller percentages of our group says that Congress should decide no matter what, or the states should decide completely. So plenty of other things to talk about on all 3 of these topics. And so Jessica, let's not waste any time. Let's get to our group questions, and we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our audience. The first question we have here, what about the role of the government as an entrepreneurial force? After all, the internet started with government funding of ARPANET.
So conventional wisdom for decades now has been that the private sector is more nimble than government and better equipped to address emerging economic opportunities and threats than a very large, sometimes often bureaucratic government is able to. This is something that was articulated by Reagan in 1980 and has generally been the conventional wisdom from presidents of both parties ever since. But really, it goes all the way back to the economist Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, centuries ago. And so I don't know that Roosevelt or Johnson felt that the public sector would be as flexible, as nimble as the private sector in making these types of economic decisions. But what both Roosevelt decided with the New Deal and Johnson with the Great Society is that it was worth sacrificing some of that flexibility in order to provide an influx of investment at the level that it's more difficult for the private sector to do. So I don't know many who would argue that the federal government is better equipped to move and to change course quickly as opposed to the private sector. Rather, the counter argument is, would the larger level of investment outweigh the benefits of that flexibility that the private sector, generally is able to accomplish to a greater degree than government?
How much of a problem will it be to get Joe Manchin on board for a really big program?
Well, it depends on the really big program. Manchin, while he is a very conservative Democrat, is a Democrat. And over the course of his time in the Senate and as governor of West Virginia, he was pretty inclined fairly frequently to invest in large-scale government programs. But Manchin is very, very aware of the critical role that he plays in for the Biden administration in terms of getting a 51 vote majority on anything in the Senate. And as many of you have probably read this morning, just last night, the Senate parliamentarian ruled that in fact the Senate can use the reconciliation procedure that allows bills to pass by 51 votes rather than 60, that the Senate can use that reconciliation procedure much more frequently than had previously been believed. And so instead of having just one more 51 vote bill that the Senate can pass this year, all of a sudden Biden has at least a few and maybe many more. And for almost every single one of those 51 vote bills, he's going to need Joe Manchin. And Manchin will come on some things, particularly if the Biden administration is willing to make allowances for his priorities, like they were on the COVID bill earlier in the administration. But Manchin knows that he has an unusual amount of power, and he'll use it to his benefit. Simply being a knee-jerk naysayer doesn't help him all that much. So look at him to use his role to extract concessions and to shape policy rather than just stop it dead in its tracks.
What is the difference between isolationism and restraint as foreign policy?
Semantics, for the most part. My own opinion is that isolationism means that the US largely withdraws from its role in the world. And historically, we've seen every time that sentiment, in terms of the electorate, has guided our elected decision makers, and we have withdrawn from our responsibilities in the world, others, bad actors, have generally filled that vacuum. Restraint, can be defined in a lot of different ways. And so for me, isolationism is a much more absolute term. Restraint simply means that we may engage in the rest of the world, but we just may not do it as aggressively or as ambitiously or on as broad a scale as we have in the past. So if restraint means being careful about our international engagements, I think that's totally legitimate. But for those who avow a more strident form of isolationism or protectionism, who use a word like restraint to describe their goals, that's a much different type of approach. So restraint is a very handy word that can be used to mean a lot of different things in a lot of different ways.
How much does the rising economy and faster rate of vaccinations threaten to block or reduce the size of Biden's infrastructure package in the Senate?
Okay. It doesn't look like there's going to be very much at all that reduces the size of Biden's infrastructure proposal, except for maybe Joe Manchin and a few other more centrist Democratic senators. But unless there is a full-on, much larger surge in terms of COVID than appears to be the case so far, then it's difficult to see the administration changing direction very much at all. If in fact, and boy, I hope I'm wrong, but if in fact this fourth surge, even with the progress the country's been making in terms of vaccine, if this fourth surge does end up being much broader and much deadlier than most people believe right now, then that's going to cause a rethinking not just of this infrastructure plan, but of any number of public policy priorities. So let's hope that's not the case.
Biden sold the country as a moderate, albeit still liberal. His actions could very well lead to a bloodbath in the midterms for Democrats. Do you agree?
Well, as all of you know by now, I'm not really good at predictions, but I will tell you what I think the Biden calculation is. That it's worth taking a risk for all the reasons I talked about earlier. That whether it's a year of COVID, whether it's a residual Trump backlash, or whether it's been a gradually building strength of the liberal base of the Democratic Party, Biden has decided that it's better to risk being viewed by the voters as overshooting, being overly ambitious, better that than to come up short. As we've talked about in this program before, many times, a president's party in the first midterm elections, after that president is elected, almost always loses large numbers of seats. But the one exception to that over the last several decades was the Republican gains that took place in the 2002 midterm elections, 2 years after George W. Bush was elected. And most observers attribute that unusual outcome to the very, very unusual events of September 11th, 2001. And it looks like Biden and his team have decided that COVID could create just as unusual a set of circumstances to prevent that turnover next year. And they believe that the best way to protect against that switch back to Republicans is to move much more aggressively than they would under normal circumstances. I won't predict, but I'll just simply say we'll see if they're right.
In practice, is not the new Trump-Biden protectionism not a carefully thought out policy to rebuild manufacturing, but just responding to pressure groups and getting favorable headlines? For example, there are many more workers in aluminum using industries than in aluminum production, but Biden reimposed tariffs on United Arab Emirates aluminum.
Well, once again, these are serious policy differences, of course, but phrases like terms like isolationism, and I'm guilty of this too, and protectionism can be used in a lot of different ways to describe a lot of different things. So there's no question that there is a considered public policy agenda here. Increasing our nation's manufacturing capacity is a laudable goal. The debate is over whether it's something that should be driven by government or by the private sector. And what Biden and a lot of prominent economists have decided is that because our system of government is less efficient, because a democracy is less efficient than a more authoritarian government, such as China's, that China is therefore better equipped to expand its national manufacturing capacity through government edict rather than through our democratic process. But it does cut both ways. I'll give you an example of the potential challenge that Biden faces by increasing manufacturing capacity on alternative fuels and green technology in terms of our shift away from fossil fuels. Once those solar and wind and biofuel plants are built, the jobs that exist in those factories pay a lot less than traditional fossil fuel industries pay their employees. So on one hand, this shift helps protect the climate. It also helps refurbish US manufacturing, but it also creates greater potential wage imbalance. And although we're talking about the first of Biden's two infrastructure proposals today, the roads, the bridges, the light rail, the broadband, and so on, Biden has also begun to talk about a second infrastructure package, what he refers to as human infrastructure, that provides a lot more government-based support for American individuals and families for all sorts of reasons. If we do accomplish this shift from fossil fuels to green technology for all the good that can come of it, that greater support network becomes even more important to those displaced workers.
This is kind of another follow-up on manufacturing. This questioner says, a conundrum on trade. If we limit trade from China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc., we could greatly reduce the import of our inexpensive clothing, major impact particularly on working America. Would this impact thinking on how to approach imports?
So traditionally, that thinking has kept the US from cutting back on its trading relationships, because more expansive trade does lead to lower consumer prices for Americans here at home. Biden doesn't talk much about it, but it's a virtual certainty that when we do less trade with other countries, domestic prices go up. And Biden is betting that the broader economic growth that will come from refurbishing and regrowing the American manufacturing capacity will lead to enough economic growth to make those increased prices less onerous. Jessica, I don't remember exactly which week it was, but I know at some point earlier this year, we asked this question of the group. And we essentially asked them, would you be willing to pay higher prices for clothes, for cars, et cetera, in order to rebuild American manufacturing? And if I remember, the results were actually pretty closely divided. Do you happen to recall?
I don't remember. We do so many of these, they start to kind of blur, unfortunately.
Well, in any case, I believe the results were fairly closely divided. And one of the challenges for Biden going forward is, in addition to concerns that this very large scale amount of government spending could trigger inflation, it's pretty clear when you look back at history that limiting trade opportunities also leads to inflation, at least as it relates to consumer goods also. So really smart question, and it's a very important concern going forward.
Yeah, I always also think about the impact of, with all of these kind of disposable goods that we have, if we are thinking about our environment or, more clean, green energy and things like that, not having more things to throw away and fill our landfills and our oceans and our lakes and everything else doesn't seem like the worst thing on the planet.
No, it doesn't. Toward the questioner's point, while it's more environmentally sensitive, it also adds costs, which is why retailers tend to have fought against these kind of provisions in the California state legislature, not because they're opposed to environmental protection, but because they know that they're going to end up passing their costs on to their customers, which is going to impact their sales and their customers' spending capacity.
Is it true that U.S. citizens in Japan hold most of the U.S. national debt, while we only owe China about $1 trillion?
Okay. I don't know the exact figure, but I will say that our debt to China has rapidly increased over the last couple of decades. And at this point, if China were to decide, should the confrontation between the two countries grow, if China decided to call in some of those loans, it could wreak some real economic havoc in this country. Now, that's probably not going to happen unless there were all-out military war, because it would impact China's economy greatly also. But the amount of debt we have to Chinese interests has grown considerably. And yet another reason why Biden believes a more forceful approach with China to get their country to play by the same economic and fiscal rules that the U.S. does would be in this country's and the world's best interest.
Can U.S. isolationism fit in with supporting the interests of Taiwan and the small nations in the South China Seas?
Well, as I said earlier, isolationism can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And generally speaking, these types of terms are best applied gradually rather than absolutely. So there are very few isolationists I know who advocate a complete withdrawal of U.S. involvement in the rest of the world. It's a matter of doing somewhat less and being dubbed as an isolationist, or doing somewhat more and being called a globalist. So the U.S.'s obligation to Taiwan goes back several decades, of course. I think another questioner asked about this a few weeks ago. Would the U.S. honor its obligation to defend Taiwan militarily? Should the Chinese military move aggressively against that country? And I hesitated for a while, because it's difficult for me to see President Biden or a Republican president being able to marshal American public opinion to send U.S. troops to defend Taiwan any more than Franklin Roosevelt was able to marshal public opinion in this country to send U.S. troops into World War II until Pearl Harbor took place. So I don't think the U.S. would involve itself unilaterally there. But as I talked about a few weeks ago, I do believe that the United States and its allies, and here's where the renewed diplomatic efforts become so important, that the U.S. and its allies, should it be faced with that situation, would respond in some type of multinational way. So should that occur, there would be more ardent isolationists who would say, no, even if it's part of a multinational effort, we gain nothing by protecting Taiwan. But I do think, given the history in that region and the US's role there, that should China's military take aggressive military action against Taiwan, that public sentiment would support some type of multinational defense. Isolationists would oppose, but I suspect it would still go forward.
New York, New Jersey, and Delaware have more restrictive voting laws. Why is the media focusing only on Georgia? And where else in the world can citizens vote without some sort of identification?
Okay. So this is, I think, is a really, really important point. I'm very glad the questioner raised it, because even under this new law, Georgia's election rules are somewhere, let's say somewhere in the middle of the country, more onerous than some, but less than others. So I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier that the Major League Baseball All-Star Game was moved out of Georgia in protest. The game was moved from Atlanta to Denver, Colorado. Now, Colorado, unlike Georgia, has gone from being a purple state to a pretty deep blue Democratic state. Democratic governor, Gerald Paulus, 2 Democratic senators, and Republicans have not won a presidential race in the state of Colorado since 2004. So let's offer a couple of comparisons here. Colorado does have a voter ID law. It has exceptions to it, and it's what's called a non-strict voter ID law, which means that voters can produce a number of different types of identification, including those without photos. And if they don't have an ID with them, they can vote with a provisional ballot. And then after the election, those tend to get checked. That's not that different from what Georgia will have under its new rule. I'll give you another example. Georgia reduced its early voting, but it will still have, as we talked about earlier, 17 days of early voting. Colorado has 14. Now, I want to be fair. Colorado overall is considered to have one of the most open voting systems in the country. But the criticism on Georgia, it seems to me, is taking place, one, because of recent political history, both Republican anger about the voting there last year, and Democratic anger about the 2018 governor's race. And some of it is the shift. But hopefully for those who've been the strongest and loudest opponents of the Georgia law, and they certainly do have reason to object, with any luck, they'll focus that same attention on other states that have even more onerous requirements. And those are both red states and blue states, as the questioner implied. So this is a unique situation given Georgia's recent political history. But the end result won't make Georgia an outlier in terms of state level voting restrictions. And that's something that is important to keep in mind going forward.
Has there been any reaction to Senator McConnell's threat to big corporations?
Not yet. And for those of you who didn't see McConnell's announcement yesterday, he, like many Republicans, are very angry because they believe that businesses who Republicans tend to support through legislation, lower taxes, less regulation, other economic incentives. McConnell and other Republicans are very upset because they see the business community betraying them on this question of voting restrictions and voting legislation. To me, it's part of a much broader dynamic. And as the Republican Party becomes more of a populist working class party, it's almost inevitable that its ties with big business are going to weaken. For as long as I can remember, and well before I was around, Republicans have generally been the party of business. But Republicans also generally tended to represent voters who are more economically successful and who are more academically successful. That's no longer the case, at least to the same degree. So it shouldn't be proposing that the historically strong relationship between Republicans and business is fraying. And you know what, Jessica? That would be a fascinating topic for us to pick up in the weeks ahead. We're going to need to talk about the Iran negotiations in the next week or two. We're probably going to need to talk about Russia and what's going on in Ukraine. But maybe we can make a note that talking about the deepening divisions between Republicans and business could make for an interesting topic also.
Sounds good. This questioner says, can you please explain more about this Senate parliamentarian?
Sure. The Senate parliamentarian is an appointed position, and this is essentially a referee or an umpire, an individual, an office headed by an individual that decides whether certain types of legislation in the Senate can be addressed in different ways. Now, you may remember earlier this year, there was some debate over what the original COVID relief bill back in January could include under reconciliation. There's reconciliation, which allows bills to pass by 51 votes rather than 60, is only supposed to be related to budgetary and tax measures. And the parliamentarian at that point made a very controversial decision saying that there were certain things like an increase in the minimum wage, which could not be included in a bill that passed with 51 votes. So that same parliamentarian, that same individual, that same office ruled yesterday in response to a request from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer that while historically a reconciliation bill could only pass, in other words, a 51 vote bill could only pass once a year if it were budgetary or tax related. The Democrats said, what if you amend the previous bill that was passed? Well, then can't that be done by reconciliation also? Republicans said that's not the way it's supposed to work. We're only supposed to be able to do this once a year. That's what the rules of the Senate are. But the Senate parliamentarian said last night, well, actually amending a bill that passed with 51 votes logically should be able to pass with 51 votes too. And so once again, this nonpartisan umpire made it just like she made a decision that made Democrats unhappy a month or two ago. Last night made a decision that made Republicans very unhappy. But it's worth noting, as we have before when we talked about judicial appointments, when we've talked about reconciliation bills, these types of things that help the majority party move forward with 51 votes rather than 60 benefit the Democrats now. But as we've seen in the past, when the Senate changes hand, these are the types of things that will benefit Republicans in the future. So as we've talked about so many times before, this is Democratic leaders deciding that their policy goals right now are of such urgency and import that it's worth risking giving Republicans that same power when there is a shift in control of the Senate at some point in the future.
Well, since you're on a procedural focus, this questioner says, with the death of a Democratic congressman, Pelosi's margin is down to 2. Do replacements have to be elected or are they appointed by governors?
So for those of you who didn't see the news, Florida Democratic Congressman Representative Alcee Hastings of Florida passed away this morning. And as the questioner correctly notes, that reduces Pelosi's majority even further, given the number of House members who've been appointed to positions in the Biden administration. So this is a really important distinction. When a senator leaves office during his or her term, whether by death, by resignation, whatever the means may be, a Senate replacement is appointed by the governor of that state. The way that Governor Newsom here in California appointed Secretary of State Alex Padilla to fill Kamala Harris's role when she left the Senate to become vice president. But while governors appoint Senate replacements, the rule of the law of the land in this country is that House representatives are replaced by a special election. So there's some leeway into how much time needs to take place in between the vacancy emerging and the special election taking place. But it's going to be at least a few months before Florida voters elect what will almost certainly be another Democratic member to replace Hastings in a very deep blue district. But unlike vacant Senate seats where the governor makes the appointment, for a House seat. We'll see in Florida, just like we're seeing in New Mexico, just like we're seeing in Louisiana and elsewhere. There will be a special election at some point over the summer.
Well, that hour flew by. I don't know where that went. Dan, thank you so much. Audience, great questions as always. Dan and Kim, I'll turn this back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jessica. As always, I really appreciate it.
Dan, thank you. Such a great conversation. And I just always want to thank you for all the time and the effort and the work that you put into these weekly programs. This keeps us going, and we so value your comments, your insights, expertise.
Well, I'm very flattered by your nice words, Kim, but I think you know me well enough. And after doing this for a year, I think most of our audience members know me well enough to know that talking politics for an hour isn't that much of a burden for a political nerd like. So I always enjoy it, and I'm very glad that you do and that our group does too.
Thank you so very much. For those of you who enjoy Dan's wonderful programs and would like to help keep us going, there's an easy way to do it. You can just text the name Schnur to the number in the chat on your control panel. We can't do this without you, and the contributions make a very big difference in helping us cover our costs. Hopefully soon, maybe in the summer, we'll start bringing back in-person events, but we're going to keep these free live streams going as long as we can. So thank you for whatever you can contribute. This week, on the Thursday, we have Dana Perino, the former White House secretary, who will be sharing her lessons that she's learned from the White House. This is in partnership with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And then next week, of course, Dan, on Tuesday with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. On the 15th, we have a program, The Future of U.S. Engagement with International Institutions and Global Alliances. This is with Ambassador Nicholas Burns and our own board member, Robert Abernathy. Our young professionals are also doing a program on the 14th of April, LA Olympics with Deputy Mayor Hajigian. And then we have a special program on the 21st, the Power Grid of the Future. This is power reliability. It's a phenomenal panel. So please go to our website at lawacth.org, register for upcoming programs, make a donation, become a member. Everybody stay safe, stay informed, and hope to see you all Thursday. Thanks again, Dan. Terrific.
Thank you, Kim. Have a great week, everybody.
You too.